As mentioned, this lichen picture looks an awful lot like that sketch, but I didn't Photoshop it. Photoshopping lichens would just be wrong. And again, a lichen with flowers? No, this is just how redbud grows, and there's a lichen on it too, because, I would never Photoshop a lichen. That would just be wrong. So let's take a look at the structure of a lichen. This is a picture that shows a cross-section of a typical, what's called a foliose lichen. It's stratified, and it has a structure that kind of resembles a leaf. So progressing from the top to the bottom, we have a outer covering that's called the upper cortex. The sort of hard, crusty outside of a lichen is called the cortex, where the hyphae are packed together sort of tightly. And then just beneath the upper cortex, where the sunlight can still reach it, is a layer of algae, unicellular, photosynthetic algal cells that carry out the photosynthesis. It's a separate organism, in a sense. It's a partner. I like to think of it as a crop that the fungus is growing. And then most of the inside of the lichen is sort of puffy and loose. You can see the individual fungus strands if you look really closely. It's called the medulla. And then on the undersurface is another sort of crusty layer that's sort of hard, that's sort of like epidermis or skin, right? It's called the lower cortex. And sometimes there are attachment structures called rhizines. Lichens also have reproductive structures, and let's take a look at them. So here's a picture of a lichen growing on a box elder maple in Marion County. Let's take a close look at the lichen. Oh, this lichen has a foliose growth form and apothecia. And we can see, if we make a cross-section of this lichen, that we can make out that there's a thickness to it, and right below the upper surface, that green zone that permeates all the way across the upper surface of the lichen, that's the algal layer. Most of the lichen's interior is made up of the medulla, and then there's a lower cortex, and we can see attachment structures in the bottom looking like little fingers, and those are the rhizines. This is the undersurface of that lichen, showing the rhizines, and notice, by the way, it's white beneath. Some lichens are different colors beneath, and that's important for identifying them. So here's a lichen, for example, that's distinguished by having a medulla that's not the typical white color, but a brilliant orange. It's called Theophysia rubropulchra, the orange cord shadow lichen. So how do lichens reproduce? Lichens reproduce basically two general ways: sexually, by the production of spores, typically in apothecia. Sometimes they can be flask-shaped parathecia, as we saw. And they also have fragmentation mechanisms that can reproduce lichens vegetatively, asexually, and that has to combine, therefore, the algal part and the fungus part. Notice, by the way, going back to the sexual reproduction, that only produces fungus spores, and they have to be fortuitous enough, is that the right word? Fortunate enough to meet algae with which they can form a partnership. The other two means of reproduction, which are generally asexual, can combine some fungus and some algae in sort of little breakaway starter units. So one of the mechanisms is called Sorenia, and Sorenia are little powdery pustules or breaks in the upper cortex of the lichen, and that have little bundles of algae and fungi. I think of it if you grabbed a handful of spaghetti and meatballs, where the spaghetti is the fungus and the meatballs are the algae, and threw it against the wall and formed a new spaghetti and meatballs dinner. Well, anyway, Isidia, by contrast, instead of being openings on the surface of the lichen, they're little finger-like projections, and they have to break off in order to be dispersed and form new lichens. So, powdery Sorenia, finger-like Isidia. So here's a picture of the sexual reproduction stage of a lichen called Physia stellaris. And I don't really mean to say stage, because some lichens reproduce only by the production of spores. Some lichens reproduce only asexually, either by Isidia or Sorenia. And some lichens do a little bit of each. But they don't necessarily have to do both. And they don't necessarily have to produce spores. But this particular one does. And it doesn't, by the way, produce Isidia or Sorenia. Here's a cross-section of that very same lichen, or one same species, showing the asci. We see about 8 or 10 here. And the beautiful, in this case, the really dark spores, 8 per ascus, which is the typical number. Here's a cross-section of a microscopic view of a lichen that has unusual asci in that they only contain 2 spores. 2 spores per ascus. That's kind of weird. So here's the asexual reproduction. The lichen on the top, with these sort of scruffy look to it, these are producing isidia, finger-like projections, which contain the algae and the fungi. Below is a similar species, but it reproduces with powdery Sorenia. Here's a lichen that produces spores, but you couldn't really tell by looking at it very casually because there are black dots on the top that are the openings of the perithecia. So there's flask-shaped spore-producing ascocarps immersed in the tissues of this lichen, and the spores somehow ooze out of the little pores on the top. And you can only tell that with a microscopic view. Here's 2 lichens on a tree. And here's a close-up, again, showing another hand lens feature or naked eye feature of lichens that are useful in their identification. And these are these little white flecks, these little specks that are breaks in the upper cortex. And they're called Pseudocypheli. They kind of look like Sorenia, but there's nothing coming out of them. They're just little breaks in the upper cortex. And these speckles are why these particular lichens are called speckled shield lichens. And it helps you recognize the genus Punctilia and a few other ones that are similar. The colors of lichens are of importance, and there's a kind of a special lichen color. It's a yellowish green. Rather than being gray, this lichen here that I'm drawing a circle around has this yellow-green color. It's not a brilliant yellow or a brilliant green, but it's not a steel gray either. It's caused by a chemical called usnic acid, and some lichens have it and make them be distinct from others, and it's a very important step in the identification of lichens, is recognizing that I call it a flavo color, because a lot of the lichens that have that color are in genera that begin with the name flavo, and particularly Flavoparmelia and Flavopunctilia. So here's a close-up of that Flavopunctilia, showing that interesting yellow-green color, and also, by the way, it's reproducing by Sorenia, which are groups of Sorenia that are sort of compound structures you can sort of make out with the naked eye. These lip-shaped Sorenia are distinctive for this particular species, this particular genus, I should say, Flavopunctilia. So, there is a book that organizes lichens by the growth forms. So the growth forms of lichens are 3 principal ones, 3 principal types of lichens. They are crusty, leafy, and shrubby. Crustose lichens are tightly adherent to the substrate, and you can't remove them from the substrate without chipping away some of the substrate with a chisel or a knife. Foliose lichens are the ones that are similar to what we just saw for the lichen anatomy. They're flat, they have an upper surface and a lower surface, but they're not tightly adherent, and they have a lower cortex. And fruticose lichens, they grow upright, they're shrubby, they're sort of 3-dimensional. They don't have an upper surface and a lower surface. They kind of tend to sometimes look like little bushes or little trees upside down. So here's some sketches and some pictures showing examples. Crusty crustose lichens tightly adherent to the substrate. Leafy foliose lichens with an upper and lower surface sort of loosely attached to the substrate. And fruticoses with stand-up. So here's a picture of 2 foliose lichens. Here's a picture of a fruticose lichen. And here on the boulder that we've seen before is the smoky-eyed Boulder lichen. That's a example of a crustose lichen.